Shalom, this video has to do with the differences between conservative and Orthodox practice regarding Shabbat. And I'll just tell you some stories about my recollections about Reform. Well, in order to understand Shabbat, it's based on the concept of you can't do any melacha, the Torah says, which is generally defined as work. And the Talmud, the Mishnah, defines 39 categories of forbidden melacha on Shabbat. They're deduced from Exodus chapter 35, which juxtaposes two sections. One, don't do any melacha on Shabbat, and then it lists the melachot they did in constructing the tabernacle. And so the rabbis applied the definition of what they did on constructing the tabernacle using the word melacha to the same prohibition as Shabbat. Any case, now I'll just tell you where conservative Jews generally deviate. The Conservative Committee on Jewish Law and Standards permits driving to the closest shul on Shabbat. And that was made possible. That decision was made in the 50s when you had the suburban synagogue expansion. So one characteristic of traditional Jews who are conservative would be that they might drive to shul on Shabbat. Although at our congregation we have people that walk to shul, and there are other conservative synagogues that do too. But it is permitted to drive to shul on Shabbat, the closest synagogue. However, there are people that drive to a further synagogue. What was the concern there was that people would then use the excuse to drive other places, which people do, but what is permitted is driving to shul on Shabbat. Now, in terms of food and cooking and electricity, the Orthodox define electricity as fire, and therefore do not permit the use of any electricity. They do use timers, and you have something like Shabbat elevators, which stop maybe at every other floor in Israeli hotels. There are some Jews now, very Orthodox, who aren't even using timers, like my relatives in Israel, or some of the rabbis in Israel have now said that they can't use Shabbat elevators that are preset for every other floor. You don't have to push any buttons. The conservative movement does allow the use of electricity. It's based on a very old, 1,000-year-old commentator that says that electricity burning is not the same as fire. And so it is permitted to use electricity, but not for things that are otherwise prohibited, like ironing, cooking from scratch, etc. The use of electricity that is permitted, it'd be like flipping a light switch, or things that enhance the Oneg Shabbat, the enjoyment and enhancement of Shabbat. At the conservative summer camp, Ramah, that I attended, they don't use electricity flipping on lights, and people can use individual flashlights, I think at various times, but they won't flip on and off lights on Shabbat, and they are strict about the Eruv. They have an Eruv around the camp, which permits the playing of, for example, baseball. But one thing they do is they don't keep score. They used to not keep score because they thought it was too competitive and not in the spirit of Shabbat, but kids love to keep score. So those are some of the main differences on the issue of electricity, on driving to shul on Shabbat. The conservative movement also allows the use of music on Shabbat. So we have music at our services on Shabbat. Orthodox synagogues don't. They have several reasons for that. One is that the Christians started using music, so the Jews stopped, because clearly there was music on Shabbat in the ancient Holy Temple. Also, they say maybe the string will break, and therefore you have to fix it. Well, if you don't fix it, then what's the problem? But still, you won't find instrumental music in a Orthodox synagogue or in the conservative synagogues, but it is permitted. So those are some of the main differences between the official rules about Shabbat observance between the conservative and Orthodox. I remember I attended a Reform summer camp, and I was very shocked when people openly were using the pop machine, but using money in the pop machine on Shabbat. Each to their own. That's a different way of observing. Of course, you'll notice other differences when you go to a synagogue on Shabbat. For example, men and women sit together at a conservative synagogue, but that's not really a Shabbat issue. That's just a regular prayer issue and our understanding of what is permitted and what is not. Shalom.